The week has been overshadowed by news later in the week, like the showdown between Mexico and, well, Donald Trump, President Trump, yesterday. But earlier in the week, Donald Trump caught some heat for, again, suggesting that millions of persons who do not have the right to vote voted in the November 8th election. That's the proximate cause of him losing the popular vote. Sean Spicer was challenged by the D.C. press corps. Well, if this was such a problem, if such fraud was committed, then this is a big deal. You should have a national investigation into voter fraud in this country, shouldn't you? Ha, ha, ha. And the response from the Trump administration, good idea.
Yeah.
Why don't we go ahead and do that?
And they are going to do it.
And two individuals that have been writing about voter fraud for some time, John Fund, formerly the Wall Street Journal. He writes over at National Review now. And Hans von Spakovsky, we've had on the show before. He's a scholar at the Heritage Foundation, senior legal fellow there, former FEC commissioner and Department of Justice lawyer. They've been writing about voter fraud for a long time. The Heritage Foundation has done some good work, as we discussed earlier in the week, at actually documenting cases of voter fraud, criminal convictions, 700 plus criminal convictions for voter fraud. Voter fraud of all sorts. And, of course, here in Chicago and Cook County, we understand there are infamous instances of substantial voter fraud. And the discussion has been difficult because, on the one hand, Trump makes unsubstantiated claims with respect to a specific number, and so he's not presenting evidence. And on the other hand, you have a D.C. press corps that's not really interested in evidence or the underlying issue. They're just kind of interested in trying to delegitimize Trump on the issue. So why don't we try and shed some additional light on the topic rather than just engage in the heat of the back and forth between Trump and the D.C. press corps? And to help us do that is the aforesaid Hans von Spakovsky. Hans, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Dan, Amy, good morning. Thanks for having me.
So you and John Fund penned an op-ed for Fox News. Why Trump's probe of voter fraud is long overdue. Well, why is it?
Well, for example, for the past 8 years, the Obama administration is doing everything it can to stop any look into these issues and, in fact, have attacked states that have tried to improve election integrity by putting in things like voter ID or requiring proof of citizenship when you register to vote. And all those things are needed because, in fact, we do have a problem. We just don't know how big the problem is.
Well, Hans, is there any truth to what Donald Trump is saying that anywhere between 3 to 5 million people voted illegally in the last election?
Well, again, we don't know the answer to that because we have such a rickety honor system. No states verify any of the information they get when people register to vote. And is that a problem? Well, sure. Look, 30 years ago in Chicago, the Justice Department prosecuted one of its biggest voter fraud cases ever. Among the people they convicted were more than a dozen aliens who illegally voted in the election. People say that was 30 years ago, but I recently read two federal decisions from the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, which covers Illinois, and what were they about? Two aliens who, the moment they got to Illinois, went and got a driver's license, registered to vote, and voted in the elections. The only reason they were caught was because they were trying to get a change of status, get their visas renewed, and it turned out when they were investigated, they had registered and voted. That would never have been found. Why? Because Illinois doesn't actually check to make sure people are citizens when they register to vote.
Now, as you know, of course, elections are state and local matters. So is it appropriate for the federal government to be the investigatory body kind of writ large, or should this be something where states and localities that have where there is demonstrable evidence that voter fraud has occurred or questions about processes in place to safeguard the integrity of elections, they be incentivized to kind of investigate or bring in specific outside investigators just to look at those areas?
Well, it's a matter of both. I mean, for example, the state investigators ought to be investigating these matters. Prosecutors ought to be prosecuting them, but they often don't do it. The federal government does have a role because, for example, the federal motor voter law requires state election officials to regularly clean up their voter rolls,
Yeah.
to take people off who have died, take people off who have moved away. A lot of states simply aren't doing that. We know for certain that there are almost 2 million people who are dead who are still on voter rolls across the country, and there are almost 3 million people who are registered in multiple states. The issue is how many of those folks are actually taking advantage of that, for example, and voting in more than one state at the same time. That's illegal under both state and federal law, but no systematic efforts have ever been made to actually investigate that.
What about people who are registered? Because I know somebody, this is kind of bad, but who has 2 homes in Chicago, and they vote in one precinct, and then they go and vote in the other precinct because they own 2 different homes.
That is illegal.
I told them that, but
do that.
right. But what's the penalty if they got caught? I mean, what?
Just a couple of years ago, a woman who was running to be a Democratic congressional candidate in Maryland, her name is Wendy Rosen, some opposition researchers took a look at her and discovered the same thing. She owned homes in Maryland and Florida and had voted in both states in 3 different elections. Not only did she have to withdraw from the race, but she eventually pleaded guilty to voter fraud.
Yeah, we had actually that occur with a state legislator in Chicago who gave a phony address, and that is a crime, and she ultimately was removed from office and prosecuted criminally. So, I mean, these things are real, and they do happen. And so, but it doesn't help if we get out over our skis in terms of what we know to be true, the evidence, the scope of the problem. Let's talk about what we kind of know to be true from anecdotes like this and from data that's been collected and research that's been done by Pew or by those professors at Old Dominion and George Mason, and not make wild assertions that you can't prove like President Trump did.
Well, look, I would agree that we really don't know whether 3 to 5 million illegal votes were cast. But what we do know is that is a possibility, and that's based on the data that we have. And I think it's actually great that he's saying, you know what, we're actually going to start taking a look at this and doing something about it. I mean, look, I give you another quick example of how things haven't been done about this. Just before the election, a group in Virginia discovered more than 1,000 aliens had recently been taken off the voter rolls in just 8 counties in Virginia. Many of them had voted in prior elections. Nothing's been done about it. They haven't been investigated. They haven't been prosecuted. And there's about 1,000 potential cases of voter fraud.
I mean, is there any explanation for opposition to voter ID laws? Not from the courts and, kind of their interpretation of statute and precedent, but by politicians. When you have, as you did right before the election, Vox.com, the left conceding the data, which is that there's no proof that voter ID laws inhibit minority turnout, inhibit minority participation in elections. So that's the main argument that those who oppose voter ID laws make. So if that turns out not to be true, what legs do the left have to stand on with respect to their opposition to something as simple as having to present proof of identification before you get a ballot?
Well, they don't have a valid reason to oppose it. The only reason they have to oppose it is if they want it to make it easy to commit voter fraud. And I would remind you, just before the election, remember, Project Veritas released undercover videos of 2 longtime Democratic campaign consultants, including folks who were working for the DNC, and they talked about how they had committed fraud in prior elections and were going to do it again in this election by recruiting lots of people and ship them from polling place to vote. Well, you can't do that kind of fraud if you have a voter ID requirement.
And what do you do in states like California where, providing a driver's license to non-citizens, how does that help them illegally register to vote?
Well, because if you look at what California is doing Of course, everybody now knows you can register to vote when you get your driver's license. And since California will be automatically registering everyone who gets a driver's license, California isn't differentiating between citizens and non-citizens. They're saying they're going to leave it up to the person getting the license to tell officials, no, they shouldn't be registered. Now, how many folks are going to do that? Well, I know for a fact that non-citizens have been caught registering and voting in California, and they probably have the worst problem in the country, but they apparently don't care about it.
If you had a state that was serious about ballot integrity and running free and fair elections so that those who have the right to vote don't see their franchise taken away by someone who does not have the right to vote. We don't have that in Illinois, but someday maybe. But if we did have that, what would a governor or a state administration do in terms of enlisting the federal government for help? Agencies you go to as a way to verify, to clean your voter rolls, what could be done?
What could be done is, first of all, they set up an arrangement with the Department of Homeland Security to check the state's voter registration list against the alien records maintained by DHS. They set up an arrangement with the Social Security Administration to check the master death index to take off people who have died, maybe in other states, but who were registered in your state. And on a state basis, you put in a requirement for photo ID, not just for in-person voting, but also for absentee ballots, and you require proof of citizenship when people register to vote.
I think those are some good ideas. But I mean, in Chicago, disenfranchising the dead is that's a bridge too far.
Well, how many people do you think are voting in Chicago that are dead?
Most of them are dead from the neck up.
Right.
And some of them are actually in the ground. He is Hans von Spakovsky, Senior Legal Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, former FEC Commissioner and Department of Justice Attorney. Hans, thanks always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
And he joined us on our Turnkey.Pro answer line.